behalf of my colleagues, Women and Gender Studies and Caribbean Studies at the University of Toronto, I'd like to welcome you to this March research seminar where we're here to celebrate the launch of our colleague's book, Nicole Charles. We're absolutely excited about this. I will open by acknowledging the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates, on Indigenous lands and shores of the planet's largest gathering of fresh water. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, this meeting place of Takaronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in and enter into respectful and caring relations in community on this territory. We have a wonderful program lined up for you today. Big up to Deb Thomas and Vanessa Agard-Jones for joining us as discussants for Nicole's book. You couldn't have asked for a better set of interlocutors. And to the more than 80 folks who are on this call right now, and it's going to grow, we're really excited to have you all here. For the rest of today, I'm going to turn you over to our amazing colleague, Kristen Boss, who's going to be introducing and moderating and leading everyone through the Q&A. And just so you know, you're invited to put your questions and comments for Nicole, Vanessa, and Deb into the Q&A, but we also are going to try to make this somewhat participatory. So if you're open to it, when we get to the Q&A, Kristen's going to invite you to unmute yourself. We will give individual folks who have questions the opportunity to unmute yourselves and actually join us here in this little virtual room and participate. And to all the graduate students who are already in the room with us, please do not be shy. Nicole was a grad student like you, now a colleague with us, so feel free to ask your questions. Before I turn it over to Kristen, let me just tell you that Kristen is the newest appointment in WGSI with a graduate appointment downtown. She's an Indigenous feminist researcher trained in archaeological approaches to material culture, as well as an Indigenous science and technology studies researcher. Her concern is with the relationships between colonial, gendered, and environmental violence. Boss is the co-director of the Technoscience Research Unit and an assistant professor in the Historical Studies Department at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, with a graduate appointment in Women and Gender Studies. Kristen is urban Métis based in Toronto, but her homeland is Northern Alberta. She's also the co-organizer with Dr. Beverly Bain of this year's Scholar Strike Canada, which is happening in 2 weeks. Defund, demilitarize, and abolish police, prisons, and all forms of carcerality. And we'll put the link up to Scholar Strike for those of you who haven't heard about it before. So without further ado, I leave you in Kristen's capable hands. Thank you so much again for joining us.
All right, so hi, hello, my name is Kristen. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. On behalf of WGSI, I am thrilled to be here to celebrate our brilliant colleague, Dr. Nicole Charles, on her first book, Suspicion, Vaccines, Hesitancy, and the Effective Politics of Protection in Barbados, which was recently published by Duke University Press. And we should have a link to the book as well as a discount code. In Suspicion, Dr. Charles reframes Afro-Barbadian vaccine refusal around the human papillomavirus, HPV vaccine, from a question of hesitancy to one of suspicion. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork, Black feminist theory, transnational feminist studies, and science and technology studies, Charles foregrounds Afro-Barbadians' gut feelings and emotions and the lingering trauma of colonial and biopolitical violence, while offering new entry points into discussions on racialized biopolitics, neocolonialism, care, affect, and biomedicine across the Black diaspora. Today, after a brief round of introductions, we will listen to Dr. Charles in her own words as she reads excerpts from Suspicion, and then we will witness and delight in a conversation between Dr. Charles, Dr. Deborah A. Thomas, and Dr. Vanessa Agard-Jones. At the end, we will have time for a Q&A. Dr. Nicole Charles is an assistant professor of women and gender studies, feminist studies in cultural and media in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, with a graduate appointment here in WGSI. Together with Dr. Omashuri Dryden, Dr. Charles is working on an edited collection entitled Black Technoscience here, which centers transnational and diasporic Black technoscientific praxis and methodologies in an effort to broaden perspectives on what technoscientific thought and method entails, while unearthing the politics of doing so as part of a transnational dialogue. Dr. Charles is also an active member of the International Black Feminist Health Science Studies Collective, and Suspicion is her first book. Dr. Deborah A. Thomas is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a research associate with the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Her recent book, Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Sovereignty, Witnessing, Repair, was awarded the Gordon K. and Sybil Lewis Book Award from the Caribbean Studies Association in 2021, the Senior Book Prize from the American Ethnological Society in 2020, and was also the runner-up for the Gregory Bateson Prize in the same year. She is also the author of Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and is the co-editor of the volume Globalization and Race. Thomas co-directed and co-produced the documentary films Bad Friday and 4 Days in May, and she is the co-curator of a multimedia installation titled Bearing Witness, 4 Days in West Kingston, which opened at the Penn Museum in November 2017. From 2016 to 2020, Thomas was the editor-in-chief of American Anthropologists, the flagship journal of the American Anthropological Association. Prior to Thomas's life as an academic, she was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bushwomen. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Vanessa Agard-Jones is an assistant professor of anthropology at Columbia University, where she serves on the executive councils of the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender and the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. Beyond Columbia, she is a member of the Social Text Collective, Scholars for Social Justice, and serves on the editorial boards of Polar, the Political and Legal Anthropology Review, and Environment and Society Advances in Research. Miigwech for being here. And now we will move on to listen to Dr. Charles. We are ready for your reading.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for that introduction and for moderating. And thank you, Deb and Vanessa, for being here to be part of this discussion, and to the TRU and the McLuhan Center for co-sponsoring, and WGSI for organizing the launch, and of course to Duke and my wonderful editor, Courtney, for all your assistance in getting to this point. So I'm just going to describe a bit about how this project came to be and read a few passages before we get into a conversation. Before any academic mentors, of which I am lucky to have so many, many of whom are in this virtual room, it was my own Caribbean mother's relations of care and ambivalence that shaped me and sparked my first interest in this project as I was beginning my undergraduate degree. But before that, in the early 2000s, while living in Trinidad and well before the first HPV vaccine was approved by the Food and Drug Administration, I started seeing ads on TV. They were US commercials with catchy jingles that urged young women like myself to tell someone I loved about the human papillomavirus. Never having heard the term before, I quickly researched it exactly as the ad intended me to do. These commercials were sponsored by pharmaceutical company Merck, evident by the fine print at the bottom of the screen, but never mentioned the HPV vaccine Gardasil, which at that point had yet to been approved or marketed. But plant the seed they did. Less than a year later, more pharmaceutical ads, this time with the explicit promotion of Gardasil, the first vaccine to prevent against high-risk strains of the human papillomavirus that leads to cervical cancer and genital warts, among other HPV-related diseases. Many of my friends had begun to receive the first of 3 courses of this vaccine, but for reasons I could not understand, my mother, the same mother who accepted all previous pediatric vaccines and who spoke to me and my sibling openly about sex and sexual health, was hesitant. I remember repeating the pharmaceutical company's words back to her as a teenager would, claiming that she apparently didn't care if I was one less woman to battle cervical cancer. As I prepared to leave for university, she encouraged me to learn more about HPV, ask questions, and make a decision for myself. Without explicitly asking me, she opened me to the fundamental question, what counts as knowledge about the body? Almost a decade later, when I began my research in Barbados, which sought to understand Afro-Barbadian parents' hesitancy toward the same vaccine that was then recently introduced on the island through a national vaccine program, I was often asked whether my agenda was the same as those of doctors and pharmaceutical companies interested in changing people's minds and increasing vaccine compliance. In essence, what I was being asked was, why was I in Barbados and to whom was I accountable? In navigating how to build reciprocal relations with the Afro-Barbadians with whom I was in discussion, given all that Barbados is and was, I found myself cautiously sharing my mom's ambivalence about the vaccine when it was first approved. I quickly reflected on the naive assumptions and responsibilities I held as a graduate student interviewing Barbadians, the former surrounding my Trinidadianness and the comfort I believed it would just instill in Barbadians. I realized I had a lot to learn about the complex economic and political dimensions that are involved in the ways that affects like suspicion circulated in Barbados, and the way in which many Bajans' hesitations in speaking with me were in fact often a lot about my Trinidadianness. Upon disclosing my mom's hesitancy as a spark for this research, one Afro-Barbadian mother responded, okay, I see, but we don't call you Trinidadians, you know, we call you Trickidadians. You come here and buy up all we banks and we supermarkets, y'all is Trickidadians. So here she was alluding to some of the politics that characterized the Barbadian landscape at the time, and to a significant extent continue to today, pertaining to an influx of intra-regional and international corporations, interests, and investments on the island. And in the book, I speak to these broader suspicions that exist in Barbados surrounding intra-island rivalry, the CARICOM single market and economy, which is a region-wide effort to move toward open regionalism, and that, among other things, facilitated the movement of skilled laborers among member states. The suspicions I was tracing were also connected to some of the concerns in the region that were very heightened between 2013 and 2016 around teenage sex in schools and the use of cell phones to film the sex. I show how suspicion that attaches to the HPV vaccine is connected to these other circulations of suspicion, because the vaccine is, of course, mediated through these overlapping technological, media, and biomedical developments, legacies of risk, Black female sexuality, and capitalism. All that's to say, it's within this context that I came to understand suspicion, first in relationship to my positionality, and subsequently as it connected and attached to the HPV vaccine. Merely invoking the affects of suspicion to which my mother and many of the parents I interviewed were aligned, I learned, failed to take into account these other dimensions that are inevitably involved in the ways that suspicion sticks and travels and circulates in Barbados. Meanwhile, many of the public health professionals with whom I spoke congratulated me on my research, noting the importance of its eventual findings for improving vaccine uptake, and like many parents, incorrectly assuming that the motivations of my research lay in increasing citizens' compliance. So it appeared that the reasons that many of the parents I interviewed were suspicious about the vaccine were the same reasons many of the medical professionals appreciated my work and willingly participated in it. My responsibility to these parents was and remains to narrate an archive of suspicion in post-colonial Barbados, one which encapsulates but transcends the framing of hesitancy in a biomedical sense, more capaciously existing as residue, as palimpsests of the long racialized history of transatlantic slavery and its enmeshment in infrastructures of risk and capitalism and surveillance in Barbados and the Anglophone Caribbean. One which tells of Afro-Barbadians' embodied feelings and these residues and one that engenders forms of skepticism through which they might unthinkably reason to protect their children by refusing medical technologies like the vaccine and the processes of pharmaceuticalization in which it and the Barbadian state are impossibly enmeshed. And I wanted to start these remarks with this reflection, or what M. Jackie Alexander refers to as the itinerary of an idea, because it is these relations, these transnational roots and looping senses of temporality, media publicity, the socioeconomic and political engagements in Barbados, researchers' interests, teenage sexual health, and the oftentimes inarticulable affects that lie between them that inform suspicion. Suspicion as the affective orientation and suspicion as the book. That is to say, the story of how this book came to be, like the affective suspicion and the story of science, is deeply relational. And that the Caribbean has functioned as an imperial lab for so much scientific and biopolitical experimentation is, of course, deeply significant. Part of the broader conversation in which the three of us are engaged, Deb and Vanessa, I think involves around the importance of the body, and to use Vanessa's words, we're thinking about the Caribbean and Caribbean bodies and their burdens in systems of power in the afterlife of slavery, and about the forms of care and accountability and recognition that are possible for Caribbean people across their various psychic and political and social locations beyond the state. Care and recognition that are more centrally about relationality and intimacies of relations. So in conversation with a body of transnational feminist scholarship that is attuned to the particularities of place and time, in this book, I consider what it means to understand suspicion toward the HPV vaccine in Barbados as affective and thus theoretical, as empirical, as possibility and curiosity. Suspicion is generative and fraught, sticky and contagious because it is palimpsestic, living and lasting in and between bodies, in embodied memories and histories of Afro-Barbadians in ways that are difficult, if not impossible, to let go of. When we understand suspicion as affective rather than an intentional form of resistance, it necessarily complicates narratives around suspicion as mere irrational refusals of protection, or refusals based in misunderstandings of science. And I think it's important to note that even as popular media has begun to some extent to steer the conversation away from ignorance and misunderstandings of science toward discussions of an erosion of racialized people's trust in science, and we're seeing this especially over the past 2 years in the wake of COVID, there is still less of an impulse to interrogate the term hesitancy itself, which is one of the main goals of this book. In post-colonial Barbados, as Afro-Barbadian suspicion attaches to the capitalist interests behind the promotion of the vaccine, to young Black girls in particular, and to historical tropes of hypersexuality, the term hesitancy's historical tropes are revealed, exposing the persistence of histories of racialized science in the 21st century and Afro-Barbadians' warranted concerns of the same. So I'm just going to read a couple passages to emphasize some of the book's stakes before opening up to a conversation with Deb and Vanessa. So I'm reading from chapter 4, entitled Care, Embodiment, and Sensed Protection. Afro-Barbadian suspicion is an embodied corporeal affect that calls into question the protection offered by the vaccine and its effects on women's reproduction and futurity in ways that disconnect these citizens from the ideas and objects deemed suspicious and untrustworthy. As parents detail, suspicion is protective, not just from the vaccine and its unknown side effects, but against big pharma, the perceived financial motivations of government industry partnerships, and the state's overarching interest in the healthcare of its citizens. In this way, suspicion as protection is an ethics that complexly confronts the state's biopolitics and priorities to ethically protect and educate Barbadians. And yet, suspicion is fraught. In a context where care for and about cervical cancer is urgent, suspicion's potential to engender refusal of the vaccine inevitably threatens attempts to save lives. Continued low HPV vaccine uptake rates can have grave health repercussions for the young women and men whose parents are seeking to protect them via suspicion and perhaps refusal of the vaccine. Indeed, suspicion is impossibly imperfect, and although it might offer protection in multiple senses, it might also engender the refusal of life-saving interventions resulting in disease or death. Still, it is true that danger lies in pathologizing Afro-Barbadian parents' suspicion and hesitancy as something to be summarily overlooked and eradicated, as it does in viewing vaccination as the sole means of sensibility. Like the grammar that has historically overdetermined Black women as hypersexual, deviant, and in need of care and salvation, the dominant logic and language of vaccine hesitancy overwhelmingly, inadvertently, and paternalistically naturalizes protection and care via vaccination as uncomplicatedly benevolent. We ought not forget, too, that suspicion's antonym, certainty, is similarly complex, fallible, and fraught. Certainty refers to truth, fact, assuredness, and absence of doubt. Positioning themselves as the vanguards of biomedical protection and truth, the doctors and nurses I interviewed stressed to me the importance of projecting a sense of certainty about the dangers of HPV, the scientific efficacy of the vaccine, and the ills of the internet in order to mitigate or override parents' suspicion. And here I'm reading from chapter 5, entitled Suspicion and Certainty. Alongside international public health efforts to mitigate the influence of growing anti-vaccination online forums, Barbadian health professionals decried these groups and the internet writ large, believing them to be directly associated with fake news and parents' feelings of suspicion and hesitancy toward the vaccine. Through this seemingly benign discursive process of linking vaccine hesitancy with anti-vaccination rhetoric and fake news, several entwined material and ideological moves are accomplished. First, in the Barbadian context, this move elides the voices of the predominantly Afro-Barbadians with whom this book is concerned, for whom suspicion attaches to the vaccine, its pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the state administrators, the uncharacteristic way in which it was introduced and promoted across the island, colonial tropes of Black women's hypersexuality, and related histories of biomedical injustice and experimentation on Black women from the period of slavery. By overlooking these complex politics, affects, and histories, vaccine hesitancy becomes effectively and dangerously conflated with anti-vaccine sentiment, come disinformation and fake news. Through this process, vaccination and its benefits are heralded as authoritative modes of absolute truth and certainty, the antithesis of suspicion, which ought to be eliminated rather than examined for the insights it might offer public health practitioners and scholars. While vaccine hesitancy might exist alongside anti-vaccine sentiment for some people, the two ought not be conflated. While for many of the Afro-Barbadian parents with whom I spoke, suspicion did engender a refusal of the vaccine, it simultaneously asked questions and fostered its own understandings of care and protection, histories of injurious biopolitics under slavery system of racialized and gendered capitalism, and the Barbadian state's accountability to its citizens and its enmeshment in global state industry assemblages. By subsuming parents' suspicion in the rubric of fake news, medical professionals effectively obscure these realities. Accompanying many medical professionals' valid concerns about fake news and their frequent conflation of anti-vaccine propaganda and suspicion is a belief in the certainty of biomedicine and of biotechnologies like the HPV vaccine as uncontestable forms of protection. Still, though, many of the nurses I interviewed offered insight into the multiple suspicions that simultaneously exist within the medical profession. While Barbadian nurses and doctors were generally unified in critiquing Afro-Barbadian parents' misinformed beliefs and online activities as the main drivers behind suspicion, They also inadvertently revealed the ways that the binary they so often projected between suspicion and certainty is in reality more tenuous than they would like it to be. Alongside their espoused certainty about parents' lack of internet literacy, the efficacy of the vaccine, and the ills of suspicion, were deep-seated suspicions about each other and the degree of certainty and strength in public outreach that each group, doctors and nurses, was presumed to have in convincing the Barbadian public of the safety and necessity of the then newly introduced HPV vaccine. Positioning suspicion as oppositional and at best inversely related to certainty overlooks the possible simultaneity, fallibility, and generativity of suspicion and certainty, and further perpetuates this untenable binary between the two. Despite fixating on the role their colleagues' certainty or lack thereof had in influencing parents' suspicion, doctors and nurses also defeatedly revealed their own ambivalences toward the HPV vaccine. Temporarily removing their medical hats, doctors and nurses with whom I spoke often surprised me by casually sharing their suspicions as racialized Barbadian parents and citizens themselves. As one doctor said to me, "I don't know many people who aren't ambivalent. I'm even a little ambivalent." Such brief confessionary narratives from Barbadian doctors and nurses illustrate the ironic fallibility of certainty, its inevitable liability to doubt, tentativeness, and unreliability. Overdrawing the opposition between suspicion and certainty in an attempt to overcome the former threatens to limit our attention to what these rubrics offer scholars and healthcare practitioners invested in less injurious relations of care, even and despite suspicion's inescapable shortcomings. To label suspicion as fraught is to recognize this and its capacity, its possibility for unsettling science. It's to call into question our quest for ways of knowing and fixing and preventing that reinscribe or replicate colonial models and modes of knowledge and power, and to open to the affective dimensions of experience that suspicion offers us, which challenge our ontological notions of care. This curiosity about care and science and about knowledge making, like suspicion, reveals them all as sites of possibility rather than foreclosed truths. Ultimately, suspicion invites a thinking about radical care. Forms of care we perhaps have models for in and through a history of Caribbean feminist healthcare organizing centered on promoting women's health through a participatory model of education and activism. And in reflecting on this moment and our situatedness in settler colonial Canada and the United States, there is much we can learn from suspicion. This is not the same thing as saying we can neatly map suspicion onto different vaccines, different communicable diseases, and sociopolitical circumstances, because we cannot and should not. Suspicion is an Afro-Barbadian vernacularized framing of hesitancy in relationship to the HPV vaccine and politics of race and sex and colonialism in the Caribbean. Rather, in this moment, suspicion's transnational offering toward radical care might look like a call for global vaccine equity alongside better access to social services like paid sick days. It might look like a move away from an overwhelming reliance on colonial curative logics to more participatory action research and effective forms of healthcare that are based in community. And this means work all the time, every day, not just during a pandemic, to empower racialized populations and to meet their unique health needs. It means appreciating suspicion's generativity and recognizing that if suspicion is to be thought of as conspiratorial, perhaps it is, as radical Caribbean feminist activist Andaye phrased it, a conspiracy of mutual caring, one that takes a village to actualize, one that inspires, as she says, medicine as art.
Thanks, Nicole, for your beautiful words and your incredible book. We're going to hear from Vanessa now, Dr. Vanessa Agard-Jones. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Kristen. Thank you so much. I know Deb and I had a bit of a back conversation about Deb maybe going first, but I'm happy to go first if that's what works. Deb, if you'd like to, if you'd like me to cede the floor, I'm happy to do so.
I would like you to cede the floor. I don't want to follow Vanessa. That is my issue. So, I just want to thank you for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate in this discussion of Nicole's really lovely and amazing book. It's so great to be able to gather to celebrate great work. I just wish that we were sort of in person and that we could eat some good food afterwards, but we'll have to, as we said earlier in the call, we'll have to just do that another time. So I'm going to say a few words about the book. Some of what I have to say will reiterate or maybe pull out particular aspects of what Nicole has introduced. And I'm going to link it also to, I think, some broader interrogations of sovereignty that are occurring sort of across Caribbean ethnography right now, and to sort of think about what kind of intervention is being made with this particular study. So Suspicion is an ethnography of public health and affect in the wake of the plantation in the Caribbean, but it's also much more than this, right? As Nicole has just laid out for you, the monograph really puts Afro-Barbadians' hesitancy regarding the HPV vaccine within a much broader historical context of racialized science, biopolitical interventions into Black women's bodies, both during and after slavery, nationalist obsessions with respectability during the anti and post-colonial moments, and more recent global economic shifts that have left Bajans wondering about the human effects of their government's capitulation to global economic neoliberalism. Throughout Nicole's text, Hesitancy also brings into view a longer conversation regarding how Black parents protect their children within the context of, in her words, historical and colonial anxieties around Black female hypersexuality and heteropatriarchy. And I know she just said that, but I wanted to really sort of emphasize that. Nicole resituates vaccine hesitancy as suspicion in order to get at these logics and these reframings of notions like protection, to understand parents' decisions about whether to give their 10 and 11-year-old girls and boys the vaccine. Because hesitancy challenges doctors' assertions of scientific truth and biomedical certainty, suspicion becomes a way for Afro-Barbadians to refuse the logics of a biopolitical state and to assert their own frames of knowing, whether this has to do with intuition or oral history, or spirituality, or alternative forms of care and healing. What Nicole shows us through her careful ethnography is that parents' decisions not to vaccinate their children, and particularly their girls, are not rooted, as she just said, in ignorance and irrationality, but instead in these longer histories and experiences of racial and sexual injury and broader hierarchies related to race, class, color, education, and authority. And Nicole reads these histories and hierarchies as having produced a set of affective intensities that guide people's decision-making about new phenomena and that provide insights into the ambivalence that people feel about care and risk. Her attunement to the forms of refusal parents articulate also helps us to see suspicion as a horizon of radical potentiality, one that is grounded in care. So Suspicion as a text contributes not only to medical anthropology, investigating as it does response to a critical public health campaign designed to ameliorate the very high rates of cervical cancer throughout the Caribbean region, but also to the broader and ongoing theoretical discussions within the Caribbean and beyond, rooted in transnational Black feminist scholarship about the afterlives of slavery, the problems of nationalism, and the exacerbated inequalities produced by neoliberalism. As those of you who know me might expect, I was particularly compelled by Nicole's understanding of suspicion as an these are her words, an affective relation that circulates in the various socioeconomic, political, cultural, and historical formulations that contextualize the vaccine, growing assemblages of multinational pharmaceutical networks and the state, and longer transnational histories of slavery, capitalist extraction, and public health. And that's the end of that quote. Like others, Nicole is embracing the usefulness of thinking through decisions about self-determination and about bodily sovereignty through the language of affect. Paying attention to affective intensities, the spaces in which non-utility thrives, refusals of the terms of recognition, and moments of flagrancy is a way to unhinge normative understandings of sovereignty, a way of thinking beside as well as with presumptions of possessive individualism and developmentalism, and a way of siding, if you will, with Nietzsche's madman. Thinking through affect offers us a conceptual space for analyzing historical formations as dynamic and as simultaneously constrained by the institutions, economic realities, and political conceits of different eras. And this is what Nicole does throughout the book. She shows us how an understanding of suspicion as an affective intensity draws our attention to the historical, political, and economic legacies of New World conquest, as well as to aspirations for a new arrangement of our normative understanding of both geopolitical and interpersonal spheres. So if we're interested in the afterlives and the new lives of imperialism and slavery, and in how citizenship, relationship, and responsibility are being reconfigured in unpredictable ways, then we must be attuned to the ways affective intensities emerge from particular histories and embodied memories, how they enact modes of refusal, and how they generate new possibilities. So I want to direct us towards some of the parents' comments in order to identify some of the ways that vaccine suspicion provides a portal into these broader problem spaces, the problem spaces in which vaccine introduction sits. So the first kind of problem that I will sort of put a bucket under is the problem of quote unquote saving Black colonial subjects through the logics of science, itself enveloped in these developmentalist and geopolitical hierarchies. And so I want to read some of what Randall says. Randall is a successful Afro-Barbadian business owner and father of a young tween for whom he refused the HPV vaccine. And he's talking about the government, right? So he says, I think they're puppets. The government of Barbados is under the same pressure as those in other smaller countries. We decided that we don't want to condone, well, let me make sure I get this right. Okay, we don't want to condone buggery. It's against the law. We have our issues like everyone else with homosexuality, yet we're being told that if we don't amend our laws to fall in line with the world's laws, then there will be sanctions. Huh? Well, if you're going to sanction me for that, who is to say that you wouldn't threaten me with sanctions for not agreeing to vaccines? So they must be following others. I mean, why do we always follow what Americans do? So here, I think what's so interesting is how homophobic anxieties are linked to geopolitical anxieties and to skepticism about the government's motivation for introducing this vaccine to the Barbadian market. And in fact, you know, one of the phrases that we see a couple times in the text articulated by parents is that this is something that the government is pushing down our throat, right? This is like the Goliath pushing a set of values and understandings of the body and forms of value given to particular kinds of knowledge down David's throat. Right? Indeed, a man named David, who is a 49-year-old teacher and father of two who decided, again, not to vaccinate his daughter, shares some similar resentments. He says, I don't understand the need. I mean, yes, there's a high incidence of cervical cancer in the Caribbean, but does that necessitate a government forcing you to inoculate your child, vaccinate your child? Because when they come on TV, they make you appear to be stupid for not taking it. How dare you? And there it's that how dare you that I find so compelling. It's like, how dare you treat me, a citizen, as somebody who doesn't have knowledge and have understanding of the world. And again, I think that's an indictment of a particular kind of circulation of value, of knowledge, of science that is obviously being rejected by these parents because of the ways that it's being presented, as if one should blindly trust in government and blindly trust in the medical establishment. And of course, we know that these institutional spaces have not always been safe for Black people. The second kind of problem space, and Nicole sort of raised this in some of her reading, is the problem of Black women's sexuality. A number of parents, of course, were concerned with exposing their daughters to the vaccine at such a young age, right? This is 10, 11 years old. So Pamela, who is a writer and mother of two, says this: I guess what the nurses were saying was that if the child is promiscuous, then it's important. And that's the thing that has me, this idea of the girls as promiscuous. If you raise your daughter, yes, you can't predict the future, but if you're raising your child to have morals and standards and stuff like that, then I don't know if my daughter needs this right away. I know that there's a high prevalence of sexual activity in secondary schools, but I just don't think it's up to me to put that HPV in her system when it's not there now. So it's this concern here, again, with how the vaccine is being presented. And Nicole shows us in one of the chapters that though this is a vaccine that's being given to girls and boys, it's really presented as a gendered issue and a gendered problem, and which means, of course, it's endlessly entangled with discourses about Black women's sexuality, hypervisibility, and hyper-regulation. Parents are concerned not only about their young daughters' minds being opened to sex, that's one of the things the parents say, being open to sex through discussions about the vaccine, rather than through discussions with them about their development, both physically and psychologically. But they're also concerned about how these colonial strategies of regulating Black women's bodies through the logic of science continue to impose themselves on family life. And to this, Nicole writes, in a historical context of colonial violence within which Black women were deemed risky, fungible commodities, and Black women's sexuality consistently subject to surveillance, management, and study, suspicion or hesitancy towards such risk logics and biopolitical initiatives ought not always necessarily be deemed conspiratorial. Right? So this is the response to the public health workers. Right? And Nicole sort of talked about this in what she just read, but the third kind of problem space is that problem of protection and needing to protect our children from usually unstated forms of harm. And for this, I want to read a short statement by Naitri, a 51-year-old mother of two daughters who also declined the vaccine for them. So she says, I kept it to myself simply because in my experience, in my general experience as a layperson, when you tell the doctor you're concerned, they usually poo your concerns and tell you that basically we're the experts and we know better and you should really trust us. And I've learned, because I'm 51, I've learned that if something doesn't feel right in your gut, chances are it's not totally right, you know? And I've decided it needs further investigation. And I would rather have it investigated further for a few more years than to have my daughter get it and have something happen to her. And I won't sit and have someone tell me that my concerns are invalid. She is ultimately my responsibility. It's my responsibility to protect her. The doctor can tell me, oh, go ahead. Because if something happened, she'd just say, well, it was a risk that you took, and she just happened to be one of the sensitive ones. But it's my daughter who would have to live with the consequences. And so here again, we see vaccine refusal positioned as a form of protection, a choice to protect not only the, what might happen with their daughter's reproductive systems about which they articulate a bit of anxiety, but also defending their personhood and integrity, right? And understanding that what for public health workers might be a slight statistical risk would be life-changing as a personal experience. So how to imagine a different mode of engagement and communication. Here, Nicole wonderfully takes us back to the Women in Development Collective and Caribbean and transnational feminist mobilization in relation to public health campaigns, which is also what parents want, right? And in the last chapter, one of the parents says, when thinking about what would have been a better way to roll out this vaccine and what would be a better way to think about how we protect ourselves and our personal integrity, both medically and socially, right? And so this parent says, I think the ways to educate us in the Caribbean about new vaccines and diseases like HPV, being as we are suspicious people, is to get out into neighborhoods, have one-on-ones like how you're interviewing me right now, talk to people, more community works. I mean, I think you will find it easier to get some of us Bajans to speak to a community member than to attend a town hall with politicians or doctors. So parents want care that is divorced from biopolitical management at the hands of the state and its medical institutions. They want care that isn't tethered to attempts to market a pharmaceutical product and that is responsive to and reflective of the forms of knowing and what Nicole identifies as radical care, right? A form of engagement that is grounded in Caribbean communities and Caribbean histories. So in the end, I think what Nicole teaches us with this book is really what the Caribbean teaches us, that we must move beyond liberal, juridical, legal forms of knowledge and understanding to embrace the relations among the political, the spiritual, and the sensual. That history should not be thought of as static, but as spiral. That belonging cannot be reckoned through ever greater adherence to Western norms of discipline, progress, and respectable citizenship. That crisis, creativity, and care are co-constituting, and that attunement to the affective dimensions of experience opens portals to more capacious considerations of the engagements that might arise from overlapping histories of dispossession and ultimately repair. Nicole teaches us that a robustly reflexive decolonial praxis can challenge the binaries of here and there, then and now, us and them, and this should also invite us to build our societies new out of the crucible of coloniality. I thank you for your really beautiful book. And I will pass the baton to Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Deb. And goodness, having to follow Deborah Thomas is its own challenge in and of itself. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and in such esteemed company with Nicole and with Deb, and also gracious. I kind of took a look at the list of attendees that makes me want to weep. So hello to so many of you who I've not laid eyes on for so long, to whom I owe so many emails. I hope you're so well. And I'm sorry we've been so long out of touch, but it really is an honor to discuss, debate, and celebrate Professor Nicole Charles's Suspicion, Vaccines, Hesitancy, and the Affective Politics of Protection in Barbados. I could scarcely imagine a more opportune time for us to reap the benefits collectively of the tremendous insights and interventions of this work. I come to you from occupied and unceded Munsee Lenape land, thanking the folks in Women and Gender Studies, Caribbean Studies, and the Technoscience Resource Unit at the University of Toronto, Elisa Trotz, Carrie Riddich, Kristen Boss, Natalia and Joe, for the hard work that made it possible for us to gather and engage the intellectual challenges that Nicole, Professor Charles, has placed on our collective tables. In the interest of seeding space for as robust a conversation as we can muster, I thought I'd talk about a couple of the exciting interventions of this project, and then turn to a couple of questions that I'd like to pose that I hope will serve as jumping off points for the broader discussions that we will have soon come. And so my remarks will touch briefly on what I think Professor Charles teaches us about suspicion as an analytic and as an ethical orientation. And then my questions will ask us to reflect further on compliance, gut sensing, and on ethnography's horizons. So suspicion, the text, is an urgent lesson for our times about what is occluded by the discourse on vaccine hesitancy, but also by broader instances of biomedical refusal. Rather than focus on hesitancy as a predetermined category of experience or on refusal as a fait accompli, Professor Charles argues that suspicion is a more apt descriptor of the affective stance that her interlocutors in Barbados take to the questions at hand. And by those questions at hand, she emphasizes that while in the first order, they articulate suspicions about the HPV, or as health workers would rename it, the cervical cancer vaccine, those suspicions are not limited to pharmaceuticalization and allopathic medical interventions, but are also about the reverberations of enslavement, about government policy in a small, purportedly post-colonial place, about foreign influence, about state industry entanglements, and about the late liberal reconfigurations of life in the Caribbean at every scale. Ripping off of M. Jackie Alexander's important insistence that we read our worlds palimpsestically, invoking at once the here and there, the now and then, Professor Charles shows us how suspicion may be understood as a site of and resource for radical care, not a refusal of care, as dominant medico-scientific regimes might label it, but as attending to the multiple axes of power, history, and politics that give rise to the limited array of choices before us. As an analytic, suspicion pierces illusions of scientific and biomedical certainty. Professor Charles's interlocutors are not content to isolate information about the HPV vaccine from broader concerns about the generation of knowledge about it and the vested interest therein. They are clear that this is a question that requires thinking about, and I quote her on page 113, the Barbadian state, the economy, and its enmeshment in biopolitical pharmaceutical assemblages. They argue that neither the government nor big pharma are arbiters of rational, impartial choice, rather that they have vested financial interests and are enmeshed in transnational systems of state inequality that make their rationalities seem like disingenuous glosses for other motives. They insist that we not forget that the generation and distribution of pharmaceuticals remains a business, and that business operates in an uneven geopolitical field, and that the post-colonial state may be a provider of certain protections, but that it does so unevenly. Further, suspicion points us toward the dimensions of racialized experience that highlight what is not shared, even in a small place like Barbados. Afro-Barbadian and white Barbadian parents begin from radically different presumptions about their relationship to the state, and from differing historical consciousnesses that lead to divergent responses in the present. Professor Charles introduces us to Black parents who remain open to the rationalities threaded through conspiracy theories, because those theories make sense when one's community is the persistent, present, and historical target of sublimated violence. And she also introduces us to maybe formerly cavalier white parents for whom medical inequalities are not their experience, for whom doubt is not the default. She shows how history matters, both in terms of questions of trust and in terms of questions of care. For Afro-Barbadians, this is the overarching question. Why are we so often overrepresented in the category of those most harmed? Among Professor Charles's interlocutors are healthcare workers, who in their sometime ambivalence about HPV vaccines underscore the complicated gap between science's provisionality and the demands of what is called science communication, public pronouncements that must have convincing power. As Professor Charles tells us, when some of her doctor and nurse interlocutors take off their career professional hats, they share their suspicions that run counter to the certainty of their public positions. Practitioner ambivalence, Professor Charles shows us, sits squarely alongside their perceived duties to elide those sentiments or rationalities in the face of what is perceived to be an inexpert public. Professor Charles shows us how the ambivalences of her interlocutors, healthcare professional or no, highlight how medicine remains a practice, not a site of uncontested or uncomplicated expertise. As an ethical question, suspicion asks, who is deemed capable of holding this complexity? Who can understand the limits of scientific knowledge and can weigh those limits against the benefits for individuals as well as those for larger populations? And further, which decisions and by whom can be made comprehensible in the wake of those evaluations. Time and again, in most of our worlds, the scientists win. But the parents with whom Professor Charles is in conversation mount compelling, historically grounded rejoinders. Taking up the mantle of citizen scientists and healthcare activists of earlier moments, like those in WAND or in the Black Panther Party, they ask, who gets to critique scientific reason? On what grounds and how? And rather than ask permission to do so, they just do. Professor Charles warns us against the pathologization of those parents who often then decline vaccination rather than labeling them simply anti-science or anti-vax in the parlance of our time, with the implication that, and I quote, they just don't care for their kids. She shows how their decisions work in the service of a different calculus for their children's protection. These parents offer repeated critiques of science, both as big business and as an arbiter of reason and rationality. They ground those critiques both in a tradition of alternative modes of healing, and those alternative modes of healing themselves, the resources from which pharmaceutical companies have often extracted and then abstracted their cures, right? These alternative modes as the grounds from which they extract, and in a critique of corporate and state profit motive. So I want to just kind of ask you a few questions, Professor Charles, that are both conceptual and methodological. And my first question is about compliance. Since reading this brilliant book, I've been thinking about the flip side of vaccine refusal, vaccine compliance, which you reference multiple times throughout the narrative. And I'm interested in the language and ideology of compliance, orientations toward compliance, refusals of compliance, drapetomania, right, historically, other forms of refusal in a contemporary sense, about the willingness to be disciplined, to discipline oneself into compliance, to hew to hierarchy. Barbados, the one-time Little England, seems to me to be an opportune place to think about questions of authority and compliance. And this is in large part because I have my own family in my head. So this is just personal. I have a willful 4-year-old who is currently right behind that door confronting her Bayesian grandfather on compliance. My father is befuddled by this child who does not consistently comply with adult demands, who I do not make comply, perhaps more accurately. And so compliance, hierarchy, kinship, ideas about Caribbean discipline. I'm wondering if compliance might have been another keyword for this project. And I'm curious about the extent to which an acquiescence to or critique of compliance emerged in your work or in your interviews or in your conversations with folk on the island. And I wonder if you could just riff for us for a bit on compliance. I'd love to hear more about both vaccine compliance and compliance as a larger kind of disciplinary orientation on the island. I have a second, more uncooked question for you, very much uncooked question about gut sensing, because it's personal to my own project and my own thinking. Gut sense and sensibility is an important vector that leads your interlocutors to their suspicions and their critiques of a form of transnational medical reason that would ignore the potential implications of embodied difference. And as you know, I write myself about languages of bodily or somatic attunement, and I call it things like toxic apprehension or chemical kinesthesia. And I try to understand that sensing's relationship to microprocesses like interoception, which is the sense of things within the body, like a heartbeat, and more macro cultural phenomena like senses of things or beings outside of the body, like gaydar, how we sense relationally. And I always want to know, what do we make of the sensing body? And like you, I want to ask how this offers us particular kinds of grounds from which we might not only make arguments or rejoinders, but also futures and worlds otherwise, or alter life, as Michelle Murphy would have it. Yet I remain deeply cognizant of the limits of the body as ending at the skin framing, as feminist and decolonial STS scholars have insisted. And I wonder if gut sensing's possibilities are one answer to a question that Deb has actually opened for us about what sovereignty feels like, and about what corporeal sovereignty might feel like. And I wonder how might that sovereignty be wrested from European Enlightenment articulations of the individuated body? And how might a sense of distributed bodily sovereignty, of relational body dwelling, be reproduced in our descendants, biological or otherwise? So I'm thinking about the kind of the ways that the folks that you're working with are talking about a kind of corporeal sovereignty that doesn't end at their own skin. That really is about a kind of relational sovereignty that they share with their children, perhaps. Yeah, so that's the second kind of uncooked question. And I'm wondering if this offers us some sort of grounds from which we might make arguments otherwise. Are there other kinds of horizons for gut sensing in your interpretation of your interlocutor's gut fealty? What kinds of otherwise might attending to the gut produce with and beyond the question of the HPV vaccine? So what more could we do with that gut sensing question from chapter 4? And finally, suspicion is an incredibly compelling example of the ways that ethnographic projects trouble dominant knowledge regimes. Destabilizing sedimented ideas about culture, cultural belief, and cultural norms, this whole discourse on communities of color refusing vaccines for cultural reasons. You account for complex analytics arising from communities themselves and the unceasing negotiations by which knowledge is made, by which sovereignties cohere, unravel, and remake themselves. In the tradition of feminist anthropologists like Lila Abulu-Good and Deb Thomas, you write against culture, as the former so convincingly demanded that we do in her 1991 essay. And you insist instead upon the contestatory, incoherent, and unhomogenizable dimensions of experience, and refuse culturalism, instead grounding the emergence of suspicion as an evaluative habit produced out of dense webs of history, politics, and economy. So my final question then is about anthropology and about the seams between ethnography as method and transnational feminist scholarship. I want you to talk to us about how you see ethnography as method for this project and for others on your horizon. I want to hear what you think about this as a kind of core methodological commitment or not. And I want you to talk to us about the abrasions or synergies and departures of your ethnographic practice from and toward the interdisciplines. So I think you come to us with a particular kind of exciting training in women and gender studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies that helps us think beyond ethnography as solely the province of anthropology or sociology or any of those kinds of interpretive social sciences. But greedily, I just want to hear more, ever more, from this brilliant colleague of ours. Thank you for this contribution to our urgent contemporary conversation, for the beauty and sensitivity of its rendering, and for providing us further means by which we might imagine radical care as we seek to understand and intervene in the social worlds of our present, and also, most crucially, of our futures.
Thank you so much to you, Vanessa and Deb, for your thoughtful engagements. I don't know if you want me to respond now, or Kristen, did you want to ask questions now? I'm happy to speak a bit.
Yeah, I would love to hear you respond. Maybe we could, Vanessa and Deb, do you want to turn your cameras on and we can get a more conversation going? Cool.
So I guess I can start with some of the questions that you laid out, Vanessa. I think when thinking about compliance, you know, for Bajans who love bureaucracy, it seems counterintuitive. But I think that, you know, what parents really emphasized was that nothing about this campaign was Bajan. So to them, this wasn't about non-compliance with, you know, something that was, yes, it was being mandated or rolled out by the Barbadian government, but it was very much being modeled after international, specifically North American and European models. And as parents continually emphasize, this is so disjointed from what makes sense for our culture. And this is why in the book I lay out how many times the Ministry of Health had to pivot and change the way they were trying to roll this program out, because at first it was done in schools because that's what was done in North America, and guidance counselors and teachers were not sending consent forms home with students because they fundamentally disagreed with this approach. So I think there's so much to think about in terms of how this is being imposed, and Bajans really understanding that and sensing that and just having a visceral no. And at the same time, in saying that suspicion is not a no, suspicion is not an endpoint, but I like to think of it as a starting point. And then also to think about, and I write very briefly about this in the book, but this contemporary language of vaccine hesitancy, which we started to see around 2011 being used more, can be historicized within a lineage of medical discourse on noncompliance, which was a term that was used, and I mean, it still is, that emerged in the 1950s in the US. And then that kind of changed to non-adherence, because noncompliance was seen to be too harsh and really not taking into account, physicians' claims to authority, and it received a lot of criticism. So that kind of then transitioned to non-adherence. And then we see vaccine hesitancy coming into play, which, according to the WHO, refers to this spectrum between complete acceptance and refusal of vaccines in the context of available services. And so I think what the vernacularization of hesitancy does is show that this is not just about, as you were reiterating, a medical technology. Its suspicion is so much more capacious than hesitancy. So it encapsulates it, but it is much more than it. And I think about as well, current SOCA and, Trinidad Parang, that are starting to reference vaccine hesitancy in relationship to COVID-19 in the Caribbean. So like Kerwin Dubois has a new song called Maxine, which is a play on vaccine. And we can see within those lyrics, like how soca artists are making light of these feelings of ambivalence, but like as a starting point, like I know, like one of the lyrics of Kerwin Dubois' song is, "Girl, I know how you feel about the vaccine, but I want to give you that jug, and like I will give you the booster." So it's just like a starting point of, I know how you're going to feel about this. I know how you feel about this imposition. This is how we feel about these things. Onward to sexual overtures and innuendo, right? So I think that that was like a very loop-de-doo way of saying, I think there's just this recognition of the ways in which this is not something that is rooted in the Caribbean and in Caribbeanness. And parents often said that in response to how doctors and nurses would, as you were saying, Deb, like force this down their throat. And they would ask me, are they not Caribbean people? Like, how can they really divorce their identity and our concern with collectivity and participatory action from this profession that they're in, which I knew they were doing to me in private in our interviews. So that was really interesting to think about. In terms of the question on gut sensing, I think, Black feminist theory has long been invested, in thinking with and through embodiment and the way in which Black women materialize an ethics of radical care and survival. And I think that the parents that I interviewed throughout this book really demonstrate what it means to instrumentalize this collective capacity for caring otherwise beyond those that are modeled to them through this vaccine rollout in particular. And I think, Deb, I only read your book when I had sent my book in, but I think I had been thinking about how closely connected your conception of witnessing 2.0 is to what this gut sensing, what this affective archive and formation is offering. That really comes to be through, or like we come to understand it through this careful tracing of these multi-scalar economical and political configurations. And it is so important. I think this part of this gut sensing work is really about rooting our frames in these local situations, right? Like the situatedness of this research is so important. Connecting it to the legacy of colonialism and slavery is really what differentiates a neat mapping of suspicion onto another context. And I think that to think through some of what you said, Deb, in terms of embracing the usefulness of affect, to think about bodily sovereignty, this is really, really key. And it's a missed opportunity to understand the ways in which Caribbean people are consistently pushing back against liberal frames, but in ways that are not necessarily intentional or like acts of resistance. It's just you know, as I said in my comments, like these ways of being are instinctual and difficult to let go of because they cannot be let go of, right? And it's very interesting to me to see how the media has come to start to frame vaccine hesitancy or in racialized populations and kind of throw in like Tuskegee experiments. Like parents aren't necessarily naming these histories in the Caribbean, but it's so much part of their identity, like different histories, that they articulate it in such a way that's all around force. And you know, like so many parents said to me how the vaccine is being forced down their throat. And in chapter 4, I think about like what force means, what pain means in the context of vaccination. And then just one final thing I'll say about your comment, Deb, on the way that crisis and care are co-constituted. I think, you know, ambivalence is inherent within claims to care, but that is not something that is articulated. And I think that when claims to care are being made on behalf of technologies like vaccines, which are situated as caring technologies, we lose the etymology of the word care, which historically means, contains meanings of both suffering and grief, and attempts or efforts to protect from suffering and grief. And when it comes to something like the HPV vaccine and the crisis of cervical cancer, like these ambivalences between care and risk are really amplified because this campaign really articulates like the population risk logic of vaccination with that of sexuality and morality and race and gender in a legacy of slavery and within a contemporary landscape of so much socio-political and economic change that is ongoing in the Caribbean and in Barbados in particular at the time of this research. So I'll just kind of leave that there. I know there's so much that I haven't addressed and so many of your questions, Vanessa, that I didn't speak to, but maybe we can get a chance when we chat all together.
Thanks so much for your response. I'm wondering how folks are feeling. Do you want to just converse for like another 10 or 15 minutes before we open it up? And what do you think? Okay.
I'd be happy to open things up since we three have been taking up so much of the airspace, but I defer to others, of course, to Nicole first for her desires for this moment and this time.
Yeah, I'm happy to open up as well.
Before we get to the Q&A, maybe I would like to talk one question or one prompt, but you have already really answered all of the questions that I had prepared so beautifully. But a lot of your emphasis on suspicion as affect really made me think a lot about Dr. Diane Million's felt theory and her emphasis on how histories are not just thought of, but felt in our bodies. And this kind of tension between suspicion as refusal, which it is not, but more suspicion as radical care. And you write that suspicion isn't about being rationally critical, but it's, as you write, an act form of resistance, embodied respective and felt response that circulates. And so I really love this framing because it's, of course, not just about vaccines, but it's about how do we find radical care within the surveillance technologies of which we're all enmeshed all of the time. How do we respond to these, the felt relations that we sense to active and past state relations, to biotechnologies and capitalist technologies? And so I'm really grateful to have suspicion to think through vaccines and pass them into biomedicine. But I want to hear a little bit more about how radical care gets us there and how that framing got you where you needed to be. Because I think like maybe it's, we were coming up, I'm a little bit before you, but there was such a big emphasis, especially in anthropology, on refusal, right? And this sort of like, we are going to refuse, like we are going to like turn back the gaze, like we're not having it. And so I really appreciate this turn towards radical care instead, because I do think it's a little bit more generative. But I'd like to hear how you got there.
Thank you, Kristen. I think there's so many directions here. I think in kind of saying that suspicion is not refusal, I'm going to back up a bit, because I think in the lineage of transnational Black feminist thought and also Indigenous feminist thought, in terms of thinking about refusal as a way to rethink everyday struggles against anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity, in this sense, Suspicion as a book absolutely refuses this discourse of and this unsettling genealogy of hesitancy, and it embraces the possibility of suspicion as affect. So to think with Tina Khan, essentially refusing the terms that are given to us to name ambivalence, like non-compliance, non-adherence, vaccine hesitancy. And in a lineage of Indigenous feminist thought that has mobilized like not only refusal, but resistance, indeed, suspicion is very much co-constituted by political realities. And as I was kind of alluding to in my opening comments, researchers' ethnographic encounters and experiences in Barbados. But because suspicion is affective, it is not an intentional act of refusal. It might engender refusal. It might also prompt acceptance. It definitely opens up to possibilities and questions. And I think, again, this aligns with Deb's formulation of witnessing 2.0, that's like really trying to rework relations through taking seriously affective formations. In this sense, I think of Suspicion and this book as more of contributing to this archive that is affective, that is very much a feminist practice, in which liberation is collective and provisional, and that is an inside job first and foremost, right? Like that bridging work that Jackie Alexander reflects on in her reflection of this bridge called Miba. And in terms of the radical care, like I think Suspicion is offering us a way to radical care, as Healy Hobart and Tamara Nees remind us in their special issue on radical care and social text. Radical care might be thought of as something that is built on these very set of ethical and political and collective efforts in service of an otherwise. Something that Black feminist theory and Indigenous feminist theory have long been invested with and in. And so I think there's definitely utility and usefulness in refusal, and that Suspicion is offering us a way to think about possibilities that exist alongside refusal as well.
So much for that clarification and opening us up for this conversation. We do have one question, I believe, in the Q&A. Oh, we've got a couple. Rachel, did you want to read us your question?
After I sent it, do I still have access to it? Sorry. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, I'll read it. So I'm wondering whether it's suspicion. I'm wondering about the different ways that you're thinking through suspicion. Sorry, first of all, I should just say thank you so much for the presentation. The book sounds really fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading it. And also, Deb and Vanessa, your commentaries were beautiful, and again, like reinforce that I'm really looking forward to reading the book. So I'm wondering if among the ways of thinking suspicion, if it's maybe also a rejection of the kind of objective maths of science. So specifically embedded in vaccination, as it saves more lives than it takes. So presenting this as the only appropriate approach to care, the only sort of rational approach to care. I don't know if I need to, but in other words, we're expected to submit to the rationality of a math that accepts that some will be harmed, and ourselves or our children may be among those. and to the pharmaceutical racial capitalism that doesn't care but produces a life-saving substance for motivations that are not care. For example, the gathering of data about adverse effects, might this have different affects under different epistemologies of care? That's what I was thinking.
Thank you for that question. I think the way that Bayesian parents kind of spoke to this would be in terms of sensibility, and this is the topic of chapter 4, in which I offer various understandings of the term sensibility, right? So in terms of thinking about this calculus and a rejection of the maths of science, parents are showing that we might think about, doctors would say, it will take a while for parents to come to their senses. We just need to give it some time. And parents are articulating that there are different ways to understand sensibility in this context. One of those ways, if we were to think alongside Audre Lorde, would be that, disciplined attention to it feels right to me, this instinctual feeling, to get back to Vanessa's phrasing of, gut sensing. And this is not something that's irrational or rational, but a form of mindedness through which protection can be achieved. And so if we stop thinking about sensibility as always connected to rationality, we're thinking more capaciously about the body's ability to sense everything from, as I say in this chapter, from pain and temperature to memory and affects like suspicion. So I think while some parents did name, and Deborah read some of these excerpts, Barbados is small, this number of people will be affected, but it actually means, this percentage of people will be affected, but it actually means this many Bayesians, and my daughter could be one of them. Many other parents also pushed back against what sensing means and what protection means in this sense.
Oh, perfect. Rachel says thank you in the chat. We've got another question from Sunny. Sunny, would you like to read your question?
Hi. So thank you, Nicole, for this amazing work. I am glad to. I kind of remember when you first started this work, so it's interesting to read it, and I also look forward to reading all of it. So far, I've only read the introduction, so this question is based off of that. You had said that specific medical histories, such as experimentation, were not explicitly named such as the Tuskegee experiment in your talk. Can you explain a bit more how these histories of medical violence live as affective relations, such as maybe visceral ones? And how does this connect to your theorization of flesh in the project?
Hi, Sunny, thank you. So when I said that specific medical histories were not explicitly named, I meant by and large. Certainly parents did speak to experimentation, but they weren't naming things like Tuskegee. And I think that the ways that these histories of medical violence live is through the invocation of things like force and the metaphors that were continuously used. Like doctors keep telling us we have our head in the sand, but we don't want vaccines to be forced down our throat. In terms of thinking about flesh and what flesh means, my use of affect is very much situated within specific theoretical traditions of affect, which is women of color feminist theory, and essentially what Chicana feminist Cherry Moraga refers to as theory in the flesh. These languages of the South, that women of color feminists speak to and live and actualize, and that are essentially the true meaning of it feels right to me. I'm thinking of something that Kristen said in the beginning in the opening comments of Diane Million and others like Claudia Garcia Rojas, who push back against what she terms white affect theory in this invocation and understanding of affect as theory in the flesh. Very different tradition to some others that we mobilize affect from.
Sunny also says thanks in the chat. We've got another question, care of Professor Murphy. You want to unmute and read?
If not, I can read it.
I can also read it. Okay, I'll read it. The analytic of suspicion is so rich. I wonder what it might tell us in another zone where technoscience and protection converge, such as interacting with state surveillance or policing. I'm wondering if you have brought this analytic to other zones and have found it works differently or teaches different things.
I'm just trying to move the question box away so I can get back to your faces. Thank you, Murphy, for that question. I think, indeed, suspicion can be thought of as an analytic in that it is method making, to think alongside Catherine McKittrick, as a mode of Black method making that promises ways of undoing discipline and disciplinary thinking that is notoriously imbued with colonial logics. But I hesitate to, in this moment when we have so many examples of how technoscience and protection converge, I'm thinking specifically around mandates and convoys and policing, that these are radically different contexts, and there are different vernacular framings that emerge out of them. So when I'm thinking of suspicion, I really do want to insist on its usage within this Afro-Caribbean and Afro-diasporic context, and think about and push our attention as technoscience scholars toward the specific languages that are being used. Like if we're thinking of this moment and the way the word freedom is being mobilized and kind of wielded in a way that is very somehow separate from imperialism and so very enmeshed within liberal forms of, the political economy, I think, that deny the settler colonial context. Suspicion is offering us attention to the questions that we can be asked and a push toward radical care. And at the same time, I feel like the urge to caution folks against any presumed familiarity, which is something that I think I had to really work through as well in the research process, especially interviewing primarily middle-class Barbadians. One of the reviewers of my book actually asked me, how do we reconcile similarities in comments from Afro-Barbadians and white middle-class Americans, or between forms and like convergences of other technologies and refusals in North American contexts? And I think that by using transnational feminism to trace suspicion, to attune to the particularity of space and place, and really makes so that we foreground the resonance of plantation slavery for thinking through issues of force and flesh and reproduction and refusal, but attuning to these resonances is so important, because if we don't do that, a presumed familiarity might really enter the conversation. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think there are potentials for suspicion to push us towards questions about radical care. And at the same time, I just want to caution against kind of a neat mapping, because what Afro-Barbadian parents are doing is really offering a thickened articulation of suspicion that is specific to their context. Okay.
Thanks so much for that. Drawing on Murphy's question as well, like this book really exemplifies how to do place-based work that is nonetheless within an itinerary of transnational politics. And in many ways, suspicion right now is, navigating us through a time in which decontextualization is like absolutely everywhere. And I wanted to draw our attention to the beginning of chapter 4. I'll put a image in the, or I can't quite put an image in the chat right now. But at the beginning of chapter 4, you present two scenarios or two versions, version A and version B. I could read it, or would you like to read it? Okay. So you have version 1, and you write nurse, parent, teenager, vaccine, cold, fluid, vial, dilute, swirl, syringe, needle, sharp, distract, quick, puncture, skin, penetrate, flesh, tissue, pain, infiltrate, system, redness, swelling, time, surveillance, repeat, protection. And then you have version B. So we start off the same: nurse, parent, teacher, or teenager, vaccine, media, pharmaceuticals, money, suspicion, internet, research, community, videos, surveillance, memory, flesh, pain, force, skin, reproduction, fear, gut, feeling, unknown, consider, reconsider, refusal, protection. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the opening. I think it's really beautiful. Like I think it's a really beautiful vignette to begin your conversation with Dr. Jones.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Thanks for reading that. I think that that was really done to show two understandings of protection, or two common framings of protection, right? Because both instances lead to forms of protection. And that was, I put it in that way to show, later on in that chapter, I speak about how versions A, the first vignette you read, and version B seem to collide when parents articulate this understanding of sensibility that is divorced from this understanding of sensibility means rationality. And so I don't know if Deb and Vanessa want to come into the conversation. I feel like I'm taking all the spotlight here. But yeah, I think that was really important to me to lay out, to kind of push back against this understanding of suspicion or hesitancy as something that isn't necessarily prudent. One parent said to me, suspicion is prudent, suspicion is smart. And that's so antithetical to how hesitancy is framed, right? Because and that is often because hesitancy is very much conflated with anti-vaccination sentiment. And it is important to know that while, and this is partly because of how I recruited people to interview, that most of the parents with whom I spoke did refuse the vaccine, but some of them didn't, but still articulated that they were suspicious. Some accepted the vaccine and still maintained that they felt suspicious, and others were undecided. And I think that that's really central to understanding what suspicion is and offers, and how that connects with a sensibility of protection.
I saw you mouth something, but I'm not sure if it was meant to be audible. Are there any other questions that folks might have for Dr. Charles?
I mean, can I just ask you what's next? I'm not to force you into what's next, but this was so exciting. And I want to know I understand you have this joint project on kind of Black technoscience. I want to hear more about that. I want to hear more about I know that once a book is published, you're kind of all the way over it in a certain way. So I want to hear about what you're excited about right now. And sorry, I don't know what is getting in the way of my camera. Yeah, I'd love to open space for you to talk about what feels generative and exciting in this moment for you.
Thank you. I'm definitely over Hesitancy, and never could I have imagined that this book would come out when now everybody knows what hesitancy is. When I was thinking, it feels like alone for a decade on this term. So definitely over that. But I am working right now with Tanya Haynes at UWE Cave Hill on a new project that investigates the gendered and racialized aspects of diabetes in Barbados, and specifically looks through a transnational feminist frame to understand how connections between sugar cultivation and gendered cultivation of sugar in the home are connected to high rates of type 2 diabetes in Barbados. So I'm really excited about that. It's going to be an interdisciplinary project that really foregrounds the use of art and Bayesian artists to narrate and depict what subjectivity is like in a context in which has, Barbados has such a high rate, amputation rate as a result of type 2 diabetes. And so we're going to be working with local artists, one of whom we hope is the person who did the cover of Suspicion, Simone Asia. So amazing work. It's going to involve archival research as well as ethnographic research. So we're going to merge those three components, and we're really excited about that. So I'm hoping to get to Barbados as soon as possible so that we can begin that work.
And you have many pokes to talk more about the cover and more about that art. It's not mine, it's Simone Asia's. And I think when I was invited to offer up an image for this book, I thought about the tone that I wanted it to convey. And I was immediately drawn to Simone Asia's work. So if you haven't seen the cover, this is what it looks like. So Simone's work has actually been introduced to me by Tanya Haynes a few years ago. And I remember being so drawn to this piece that's called Waterlogged. So it's illustrated using colored pencil and pen and collage and glitter, and there are many layers that you can't necessarily see here. And what I loved about this image was how pensive it is, because that's what I think Suspicion offers us. There's really a layered articulation here. And while it seems that there are moments of sadness, perhaps, there's definitely this understanding of like bleeding emotion. There are so many layers simultaneously of beauty and growth through the flowers, and the use of repetition and detail really mimics Suspicion's spatiotemporal nature. Things are imperfectly erased yet still visible. And I think that that's exactly what parents taught me about Suspicion. So I love this image, and we worked a lot with Duke to position it just right so that you could see what I think is water, because these deep indigo hues really insist on, I think, coloniality's enduring legacy that are so present in the book as well.
So much for that. I think we actually have one more question from our colleague, Beverly Bain, and then I'll let Vanessa and Deb give us some closing words. Does that sound okay? Just like a Hey, Beverly, are you there?
Oh, I have to unmute. Oh, sorry. Nicole, congratulations. And thank you so much for this amazing work. I was looking forward to today. And thank you to Deb and Vanessa for their responses and their their engagement with your work. Tremendous. I was thinking as the conversation was happening and as you were talking, Nicole, when we talk about, as we're talking about suspicion and hesitancy, we're also talking and we're thinking about the way that transnational lives travel. We know that here in Toronto, in fact, I have encountered numerous people from the Caribbean, not necessarily only Barbadians, but also other people from the Caribbean who have expressed, and even though it's, hesitancy to the vaccine. And the way in which anxieties around very much of what you have spoken about in terms of colonial legacies, in this case around the way Black bodies have been experimented on, particularly Black women's bodies in particular ways, and how those travel with us, even as we travel, and move to diasporic planes across North America here, and some of those dynamics that travel with us. And I know that your work is particular to Barbados, but again, we are also people who travel from these locations, these plantation locations to other plantations location here in North America. So I was wondering what you might have been thinking while you're doing this incredible work and recognizing some of the similarities around vaccination in relation to, Caribbean people who may be having some forms of hesitancy or suspicion around vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly. And thanks for that question. I mean, the short answer is I wasn't thinking, because when I wrote the book, COVID hadn't happened yet. So that we weren't having these conversations, but I can think about your question beyond that. But I think what we're seeing now, as you're rightly saying, is the way that affects travel. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that, again, when we go back to like this understanding of what affect is and different traditions in which affect is understood, we often hear, Sarah Ahmed talks about how affects stick. And I was really interested in understanding what makes affect stick in Barbados in relationship to not just the vaccine, but these other sociopolitical arrangements. And so I think when we're thinking about how Caribbean people move, and we're thinking about the Afro diaspora, there are different resonances that allow for the stickiness of affect and suspicion. And so it's going to look different in different places. So I think we can definitely have a conversation about COVID-19 vaccines and the ways that suspicions might circulate. But again, just to insist on the particularities because of the particularities of place all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, thank you. I lied, we have one more question before we have our closing morsel from a WGSI graduate student, Ferdinand.
Hi, Nicole, congratulations. This is a wonderful lecture and I'm looking forward to your amazing book, reading it. So I was made to understand that suspicion involves affective deliberation, a process of postponement and waiting, a methodology of doubt gesturing towards the ascendancy of local wisdom and communal knowledge. How does time, one that is colonized by capitalism, affect such kind of epistemological skepticism?
Thanks, Ferdy. I mean, there's definitely a strong temporal dimension to suspicion that we can see through parents' narratives, that we can see through teenagers' narratives as well. I think in thinking with Jackie Alexander's conception of the palimpsest, we are made to understand how colonialism fractures time, how these memories are very much colonial residues that index these unsettling truths. Like suspicion in and of itself is an unsettling truth, but it also leads us to interrogate more unsettling truths about time, about histories of biomedical injustice, to think with Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot, who speaks about pastness as a position. This is something that suspicion really emphasizes to us. So I think that this localized knowledge and embodied knowledge really emphasizes the fictive nature of time, capital T, and pushes us to recognize the intricacies and overlapping nature of these legacies, in a way that we cannot think of these things as past.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome.
We have never seen a question about time handled so eloquently.
I just referred to other people.
Okay, shall we close it up? Maybe we'll just hear a last sentiment from our panelists, and then we'll let everybody go.
That is how you put people on the spot. No, I think it's just been really lovely to gather like this and to celebrate what will be such an important addition, I think, to a particular kind of understanding, the specific problem that you're addressing, but also just an expanded engagement with issues that I think really matter to so many of us. And your contribution here, I think, just, gives us so many new avenues to think with, and of course, new affects to explore in terms of their temporal and spatial specificity. So I just want to thank you all for organizing this event, and Nicole for writing such a wonderful book.
I really do not have any closing words, so I thought I would end with Nicole's words, because I think the ending of the book, I don't know if you can quite see my my response to her closing paragraph, but it really was just kind of pure elation at the kind of closing sentence. So I'm going to read that in lieu of my own words. And what Nicole says is to follow suspicion, or Professor Charles, excuse me, and rethink care is to embrace the ambivalence of care and biomedical technologies like vaccines, and the incomprehensible, seemingly impossible not doing that hesitancy might constitute, in favor of compassionate recognition, close listening, reflection, and cautious pause. And perhaps this is radical. Mic drop. Done. Thank you, Nicole, for this work. It's just stunning. I am so thrilled to be here to celebrate it with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Deb, for your generosity. I appreciate it so much. It's an honor to be in conversation with you both. And thank you, Elisa, for bringing us all together. And to Kristen for moderating. Thank you.
Everyone for joining us. That concludes the incredible first book launch of Dr. Nicole Charles. We will see you all here in 2 years to see how folks have taken up this work in real life. But yeah, thanks so much. And in the chat, you can see that WGSI has some upcoming events, which you can check out as well. Lots of love in the chat for you.